Tony Hawk's Pro Skater's first official release was in September of 1999. This is important because my first video game console that I ever owned was a Game Boy Color, which came into my hands on April 26th of 2000, on my 5th birthday. In a way, I've never really known video games without the Tony Hawk series, and I think it's the series that had its birth closest to my introduction to video games, coincidentally enough. I still have my first N64 cartridge of the game, which I think I procured sometime around like 2001 or so, used. It says property of Blockbuster on it, because we bought it used from an old Blockbuster video back when those existed. When I bought a used PlayStation at GameStop in the spring of 2004, I bought a copy of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater to go along with it. When I bought a used Dreamcast in 2008, I quickly found a copy of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for it. I still know where each of these copies are, because each one of them has their own little emotional meaning to me. Most of the games I played in my early life had a wall. For Super Mario 64, it was the barrier to the endless staircase. For Wario Land 3, it was Rudy the Clown, the final boss. For Cruisin' Exotica, it was the Mars level. My cognitive skill, my hand-eye coordination, and my ability to adapt to new circumstances as a child had a limit. For Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, that wall was the Chicago skate park, and that limit was 4th place. In order to unlock the 5th course, Minneapolis, I needed to place for at least a bronze medal in Chicago. The judges required a score of around 86 for that placement, but it slid up and down, and I always fell just short. I used Runa Glifberg, the skater whose special trick I learned early, the Christ Air, a left-right grab move early for my young mind to remember. I could get a solid combo going on the first rail, and on good runs I could hit the channel transfer from the first quarter pipe into the half pipe. From there, my line ended, and my 6-year-old brain couldn't process anything congruent. I was left to improvise, and I did it poorly. This kept me from experiencing the offerings of the Minneapolis level from that point until I discovered the internet and cheat code websites. It feels strange now, as I both recognize how easy the original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater actually is, and I still remember the feeling of butting my head against this skate park whenever I replay it. Years later, I've played through the original game so many times that I could probably get to Minneapolis on Ambien, just relying on the synapses and fingers twitching by muscle memory, but I still sort of cherish it, as well as Burnside Skate Park, San Francisco, and Roswell, as what I never could see as a young kid. In an even more curious circumstance, I was readily able to see Downhill Jam because I was able to grind out the first 15 tapes in warehouse, school, and the mall. Downhill Jam only requires 15 tapes and has no stipulation regarding getting them from Minneapolis or having any medals at all. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater introduced me to so many themes in gaming that would come back up as I continued playing games. I think this was the first game in which I found what I could call an exploit. I remember this 2-gap combo in the mall, off of one flagpole down to a rail, that would easily earn me enough points to get both the high and pro score tapes. It felt like I'd pulled one over on the game, like I wasn't supposed to be good enough to do something that well, that easily. Or how about this one? My friend Brian had a PlayStation version of Pro Skater, and when I played with him, I'd try to position my character to be able to see the video boards at the school and in Chicago. The N64 didn't have the cartridge space for those videos, so they were absent. I'm still not even 100% certain what's actually on those video boards. It's like skate footage mixed with band footage. It's an incredibly minor aspect of the game's aesthetic, but I didn't have access to it, and I really think I just envied that kid anyway. So I developed a desire to see what the PlayStation had to offer. Eventually, I bought the game for myself and learned that, no, the videos were just that, videos. Also, I guess you got the lyrics to Jerry Was a Race Car Driver on the CD versions. But that all prompted an interest in the process of porting games that I still kinda have. I can tell you about all the version differences of some of my favorite games. Sonic 3D Blast on Genesis versus Saturn, Virtual Racing in every format, Doom in most formats. That's all fascinating to me, and I think it started when I realized his version was slightly different from mine. It's been about 17 years since I first put hands on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and I'm well versed in each of the 3 home console versions of the game. The Game Boy Color and N-Gage versions are a different story, albeit. The Nintendo 64 port was my first. The Dreamcast port is the one with which I've spent the most time, and the PlayStation original is the one I've played most recently. I don't like to look at games in terms of holding up over time or not, but there's some quirks in the original Pro Skater, particularly the PlayStation release, that could have only come from this game being the first of its kind. Knowing the juggernaut that the series became, it's interesting to see ideas that were abandoned between the first and second games, like these point bonuses that spin around in the air, for example, which never returned. The aforementioned video screens also never returned. Two stages, the Mall and Downhill Jam, both have a defined beginning and end, and lend very poorly to any type of backtracking or exploration, and this philosophy was overwritten in favor of the more open stages that compose the rest of the game. There's a continuity in stage naming as well, one that I didn't notice until I was writing the script for this video, that each stage has a specific type of skating environment and an actual city location stated, which doesn't mean all that much aside from the fact that I should have been calling Minneapolis downtown and San Francisco streets throughout the entirety of this video. But this pushes to the forefront the diversity in level terrain that the developers intended in creating each of these stages. Each of them had a different core philosophy, which I suppose was also the case in the next two games, but it was never stated quite out front like that. I never noticed it. It's also important to recognize the design philosophy at the time when this was the only game of its ilk. Prior skateboarding games like Street Skater and Sony's Extreme series had embraced the sport in a light that seemed ingenuine, featuring vastly unrealistic tricks and locations and scenarios, even. These games only mapped skateboarding over previously established gaming philosophies, and instead of developing a game that could channel the sport properly. For one, there was a race or time trial baked into nearly every skateboarding game before, dating all the way back to 720 in the arcades. Though by 1999, the concept of downhill skateboard racing on a major scale had been proven basically non-existent, or at least non-existent to the communities to which Neversoft tried to appeal. Appealing to downhill skateboarding racing was missing what was actually interesting about the sport for a skewed subsection of it. It would be like making a golf game about trick putting in my grandfather's basement into an old Sprint Corporate Retreat 1996 mug. Instead, more focus was placed upon free movement, exploration, and creativity, things that are important to understand when regarding skateboarding's soul. Also, there's a craft put towards the aesthetic quality of skating that I think, well, I don't know, it's a little off the cusp of being accurate, but it's undeniably iconic, and I think it's shifted some of the perspective on skating culture going forward. One piece of musical shorthand for skate culture is the song Superman by Goldfinger. Even I've used this song in the past to capture that kind of turn-of-the-millennium skateboard aesthetic. Superman kind of overtook the concept of the game's soundtrack in the public mindset. THPS is the definitive ska game soundtrack, despite the fact that there's only like 1.5 ska songs in the game's 11 tracks, depending upon how you define Suicidal Machine's output. The soundtrack was curated by Tommy Tallarico, who you may recognize as the video game's live guy, or the composer of those Earthworm Jim games. Listeners with very keen ears and a knowledge of what Tommy Tallarico sounds like may recognize the grunt of the male skaters hitting the ground as Tommy's voice. This soundtrack is iconic, certainly, but what I came to notice about it is how well it fits within the game's playstyle. Outside of free skate mode, every play maxes out at 2 minutes, and I personally rarely finish a full 2-minute run. This kind of puts the onus on each song to develop and state a main idea within about 30 seconds to 1 minute. This, I think, is why Superman is the defining song of the soundtrack. That ska trumpet line to start the song is memorable, fast-paced, and gets trapped in the mind, especially because it might be the only part of the song you hear before you mess up and retry. The most impactful songs on the soundtrack have very strong beginnings. Just let me demonstrate here. Probably the most obvious thing missing from this game's soundtrack is, well, hip-hop. Particularly because you have Kareem Campbell in the game, and he was kind of the guy who popularized putting hip-hop in skate videos, but whatever, you know, I guess he only had so much to work with. In terms of the visual aesthetic, well, some of the fashion choices are a little bit bizarre, looking particularly at the Halloween pumpkin getup that Jeff Rowley's rockin', and Bob Burnquist's multiple tones of blue. Most of these courses look a little grungy, which is probably what they were looking for, and they all have their own atmospheres, which should be praised. I can't talk about this game without mentioning the fact that there's only one non-skate company ad in the game, and it's the 2 Mountain Dew billboards in Phoenix. At some point in the late 80s, Pepsi stopped marketing Mountain Dew as a sort of country drink and started gearing it towards the extreme sports crowd, so it was like firmly planted into the extreme sports sphere by 1999. In later games, you'd see more and more marketing within the game, kind of peaking in Project 8, where all of your communication happens on an official T-Mobile sidekick. It was a smart move to imbue the game with the sensibilities and styles from what actually led the skating zeitgeist of that era. In the years leading up to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, a few era-defining videos dropped. Toy Machine's Welcome to Hell, featuring Jamie Thomas and Alyssa Steamer in 1996, Anti-Hero's Fucktards, featuring Bob Burnquist in 1997, and Shorty's Fulfill the Dream with Chad Muska in 1998. And unsurprisingly, several of the stars of these transgressive videos had their likenesses used in the game. On a more mainstream level, in 1995, ESPN's X Games started, pushing what had been, and for the most part still were, underground sports like skating and BMX onto living room TV sets. Prominent X Games athletes, like 1997 vert silver medalist Rune Glifberg and 1999 gold medalist Bucky Lasek, were licensed. To round out the roster, there was also world industry legend turned skate businessman Kareem Campbell. Rad Rat has a really good video on him that you should check out. 1997 Thrasher Magazine Skater of the Year Andrew Reynolds, and up-and-comer Jeff Rowley, who would win the same award in 2000. But of course, the biggest get on the roster was the man whose name was on the front of the box. In 1999, Tony Hawk was 31, at the top of his name recognition and success, having beaten out contemporary rivals like Christian Hosoi and Toss Pappas to become probably the most popular skater in the world. That summer, Hawk put his stamp in skateboarding's record books permanently, landing the first ever 900-degree rotation at that year's X Games in San Diego. The 900 had been a white whale for vert skaters ever since the first 720 was landed, and it was only fitting that the biggest name guy landed it on ESPN at one of the largest ever vert best trick competitions. This rocketed him into mainstream fame, and the game coming out only 2 months later significantly helped that. In fact, it was kind of symbiotic. His name helped sell the game with skating fans, and the excellent game helped get his name in the sport out with gaming fans. I don't think I would have taken an interest in skating were it not for this game. And I know plenty of other people whose skating knowledge begins and ends with what they learned from this series. To that extent, this game is important. But it's one of the harder Tony Hawk games to go back to today. Oddly enough, it feels as if the N64 and Dreamcast iterations both significantly improved over the original within a year. The unforgiving balance mechanic is significantly reduced in both versions, and the Dreamcast version looks fantastic, and as I stated earlier, it's kind of my definitive version. In the summer of 2010, I took a job at a summer camp. I was 15, awkward, and horrible at making friends, but each cabin had working electricity and decent weatherproofing, and we were all nerds, and we all had downtime, so a lot of us, myself included, brought game consoles and shitty televisions out. I know this doesn't sound outdoorsy, because it isn't, and looking back on it, I must ask, what the fuck was I doing? I would do so much just like to have that again and appreciate what was around me instead of sitting around playing video games all the fucking time. What the hell? I was in the middle of nature at a scout reservation. A place built to enjoy nature, designed to enjoy nature in like a Henry David Thoreau sense. It's David Henry Thoreau. But instead I played a lot of the Dreamcast version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. A lot. Like, to the point where I 100%ed it. It's the only game in history that I've actually 100% beaten. And I got paid like $7 a day from the Boy Scouts of America to do it. The Dreamcast version is significantly more forgiving than the original, and for that reason, it's the one that I go back to. Purists, and yes, there are purists, will stick to the PlayStation original, but this one is right for me. This was the first step, clearly, but it was a hell of a first step. And it codified a lot of what made the extreme sports game genre. In the years following 1999, imitators would come and go, hitting and missing on what made the first Pro Skater such an excellent translation of sport into game. Neversoft still had somewhere to go, and they knew they had a hit on their hands, even dropping a hint in the game's credit at a Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. It wouldn't even take a full year for that game to come out.
Dream with me, you will see.